Befriending creation via the way of awe, delight, and amazement. Just to be is a blessing. Creation is inherently good. We are fearfully and wonderfully made. Our bodies have the capacity to open us to a sensuality grounded in the earth. Our passions are an expression of the spirit which breathes in all of creation. Awe is the beginning of wisdom. Gratitude and reverence open us to the intimacy, intensity, and immensity. The via positiva is a way of tasting the beauties and cosmic depths of creation. Celebrating the awesome splendor of the cosmos, we rejoice. We are intimately part of all that is. We proclaim our praise with the words of our ancestors, Alleluia, Alleluia, Alleluia. We worship in the midst of mystery to express our gratitude for creation. We joyfully embrace the one which is the source of creation. Our gratitude for the beauty of the earth is beyond measure. We revere the intricate design of creation, the splendid symmetry of the cosmos, and the delightful dance of our fellow creatures. We open ourselves to the wonder of all that is. We look with awe upon the intimate details of love's embrace and marvel at the abundance of grace. We praise the one who is, was, and evermore shall be, beyond the beyond, and beyond that also, Christ, the cosmic one. Christ is born in us, with us, through us, and beyond us. Alleluia. befriending the darkness, letting go and letting be, in darkness and nothingness, in the silence and emptying, in the letting go and letting be, and the pain and suffering that constitute and are equally a real part of our spiritual journey. The via negativa is a way of emptying oneself and befriending the darkness. Language cannot do everything. Listen to what our ancestors already knew thousands of years ago, as it is recorded in the book of Amos. I despise and reject your feasts. I am not appeased by your solemn assemblies. When you offer me burnt offerings, I reject your oblations and refuse to look at your sacrifices of fattened cattle. Spare me the racket of your chanting. Relieve me of the strumming of your harps. Instead, let justice flow like a river and righteousness flow like an unfailing stream. The via creativa is a way of expressing the marriage between the via positiva and the via negativa. Just when we think new life will never come again, the path of giving birth, creating, imagination, and passion opens us to new possibilities of our own divine nature. God is not out there somewhere, but right here in our midst and within. Mechthild of Magdeburg wrote, "The day of my spiritual awakening was the day I saw and knew I saw all things in God, and God in all things. I, who am divine, am truly in you. I can never be sundered from you. However far we be parted, never can we be separated. I am in you, and you are in me. We could not be any closer. We two are fused into one, poured into a single mold. Thus, unwearied, we shall remain forever." Humans are capable of great creativity and great destruction. Discerning between the two requires justice and compassion. As we become more just and compassionate, we become more fully human. The via transformativa. I invite you to unmute yourself as we begin our chat. I was very deliberate in the choice of a title. Worship who, what, where, why. And I think in that order is very particular. A lot of our worship over the last 20 years has been born out of fear. The fear that people are walking away, that worship isn't what people want to consume, or at least the kind of worship that we're offering isn't what people want to consume. So we've bought into this notion of making our worship more attractive for the consumer of worship. And out of that fear, I think we have lost dimensions of what worship can be. Some of you will recognize this particular worship offering as inspired by the work of Matthew Fox in Creation Spirituality. And I wanted to begin there because, well, don't get me wrong, I like happy, clappy worship as much as the next person. But when that's the only thing that people are striving for, we miss all sorts of dimensions of worship. And I think that including non-dualistic thinking in our approach to what worship can be is crucial if we're going to get beyond this notion of creating consumable worship. And so I'd like to begin with the question of who we are worshiping, because progressives tend to range across a spectrum here. And I think that some people claim to be progressive simply because they're using inclusive or expansive language for divinity, but they're still offering the worship of a theistic deity. And so I'd like to begin there by asking you, when you worship, who or what are you worshiping? And then we'll get to the question of why. Anybody want to jump in with the who or what piece?
It's a little difficult at this hour, but the mystery that we call love is what I keep referring to in my mind when I'm dealing with trying to create a worship, a service.
Thank you.
I very similarly, I now have no sense of there being a being, but there is this love that is, for me, indisputable, and everything we learn makes it more impressive, more exalting, just to encounter this love that is everything, that somehow everything is an expression of love. That includes every atom in the universe and us. And so that it's a sense of entering into that awareness of the sacred in me and in everything.
Denise and then Jackie.
There are three ways that I am now experiencing God. God as presence, God as mystery, and God as love. And it surrounds me. I mean, it's inside, it's outside, it's everywhere. But what I have not been able to do is to worship with words. It's worship. I know it is because of the experience, but there are no words in it. So I hope I learn, if I'm going to share this with others, which I want to, I think I need to have some words that make sense.
Thank you. Jackie?
Like Denise, I experience that love as present. So presence is a word that also speaks to me, as well as mystery.
Anyone else? Mary Ellen.
I think I would totally agree with presence is what resonates for me as well, and being present, fully present to others and in nature is where I see God reflected the most. And it's also worship to me is connection. So being present is all about connection. And I think what Andrew said, I don't see God as a being. I experience God as an energy. So being in the energy of gratitude and wonder and awe at all of it, and beauty, to me is what worship is about. And that takes place anywhere.
Steve?
I agree with everyone. I think it goes back to last week, though, about just the term worship, in that its presence and whatever. I think we touched upon it in Via Positiva, the acknowledgement of the awe and thanksgiving and whatever is different, and gratitude and is different than worship, in that I think our worship came about because of the sky god concept, and we were afraid of the sky god, and we worshipped him, if you will, to appease him, and that doesn't make any sense anymore. I think John Dominic Crossan said in one of his books, there's no forgiveness or punishment, there's only consequence. And so we're not trying to appease God to keep him from punishing us, to keep the tornado out of our locality or whatever. But we understand that God is this force that we have to work with in order to transform ourselves, redeem ourselves as people, become more human. So Again, I like a different word than worship, but I'll let that go.
Okay. Okay, I'd like to respond to what I've heard. And I'm going to hold on to that piece about the word worship and just say that what we have generally experienced as worship, I would agree, is problematic. I'd like to talk about what worship may be at those moments when we experience what Mary Ellen talked about as connection, and some of you spoke of as presence. But I'd like to begin by pushing you a little farther. Most of what I heard falls into the category of what I would say is via positiva. Lots of words. And please understand that this doesn't mean positive, just as negative doesn't mean negative in the simplistic sense of those words. What the via positiva is about is the celebration of what is, the celebration of presence, the celebration of and awe and wonder and all of those things that the celebration of love, as some of you have described it. I don't think in this group we need to have spend much time on this notion of God is not a being. Most of us are atheists. And by that, I mean atheists in the true sense of the word. We're not worshiping a personified being. The original Christians, the worst thing that the Romans could accuse them of was atheism, because they refused to believe in the pantheon of beings. And I think the personified deity that we have been worshiping, as Steve says, doesn't work anymore. So we're moving on to try and understand the divinity in broader terms. So what I heard was a lot of via positiva. And one of the things that I think is really, really problematic with our worship is that we lean heavily into the via positiva because that's more consumable. So here's an example of the via negativa. Some of you mentioned this notion of presence, but can you also experience the divinity in absence? So we don't have a word for it in English, and the closest word I know happens to come from Portuguese, and the only way I know it is someone taught it to me a long time ago. It's the word saudade, which means you feel someone's presence through their absence. And so think about it, someone you have lost, like they're gone, they've died tragically. Everywhere you look, you experience that person through their absence. Saudade. I can feel your presence through your absence. And so, how do we then experience divinity in absence, in darkness, in love, and in hate? If we're talking about a divinity that in which we live and move and have our being, then everything is in God. And I'm going to use the God word because it's the most accessible to us. And everything is in God, and God is in everything. And I think what we want to do is experience God in everything we love and everything that loves us. But can we also experience divinity in the darkness and in the absence and in the turmoil? Because if not, then how do we traverse the turmoil? If we're looking for the happy clappy fellow, the Jesus is a sun, my sunbeam, or whatever that thing goes. I mean, how do we experience in the muck and the mire of the stable divinity? I think that what our worship fails to do so often is to allow us to move beyond dualistic thinking. Darkness bad, light good, right? But in the darkness, I mean, think of the cosmos. Stuff is born and created in the darkness, in the void, in that chaos. How do we experience the divine in all of it? And what we're doing here is suggesting, or at least Matthew Fox he's insisting, that it is through the marriage of the via positiva and the via negativa. And the via negativa is a place where words fall away, Denise. It's the place where Andrew says God is love, and I say, no, Andrew, God is not love. Our knowledge of love is so limited, and God is so much more than that, right? So the word love no longer becomes adequate, right? And the marriage between the via negativa and the via positiva creates the via, out of that is the via creativa is born. You can't be truly creative without both elements present. And it's through this creative process that we are transformed. The via, and please don't think of this as linear, because it's anything but linear. Think of circles. It's happening all at once. It's like a bubbling ooze that's happening all at once. The via negativa, positiva, oh, creation here, a little creation there. Oh, I'm transformed in this particular part of my life, right? So it's not, okay, I'm going to do the via positiva now, then I'm going to do the via negativa, and then I'm going to travel down and be on the road of creativa, and then suddenly I'm going to be transformed. That's not how it works. It's if we want to worship together, we have to recognize that what we're trying to do is come together, connection, as you put it, Mary Ellen. We're trying to come together. We're trying to connect not only with one another, but with that which is so much more than we are. And that connection is firing all over the place. It's not simply a rote form that is going to get us to transformation. And I think worship that doesn't have the possibility that transformation is going to happen is probably pretty accurate if they haven't already taken into consideration, including the negativa and the positiva, the images, the lack of images, the words, the inability to form words, the creating something. What are we trying to create in worship? Most of the time is we're trying to create fertile ground for justice, right? And how does that creativity transform us? Or we're transformed and suddenly we want to create justice. Or we've experienced the absence of divinity. And so we're longing for the presence of divinity, and we create new ways to open ourselves to that presence. Does that make any sense to anyone?
Longing to create new ways is the biggest. How do I say this? I know what I dislike about so many words that are that roll off people's lips. I don't know, like something good happens, and then somebody said, "Oh, God is great," or something, or "Oh, God knows what He's doing," or something. And anyway, we've been there before. But what I'm trying to say is I'll just tell you a tiny little bit about myself. We're a very small group, and we're not, we're shared ministry, and we're overseen by the Anglican and the United, and then we keep getting ministers, and we kept firing ministers, so we just fired them all, and we don't have any minister at all, and we just kind of are allowed to rule ourselves. So we really do go all over the place, and it's really, really exciting. But there's a for me, but they want putting new words, putting long spaces of silence is I don't know, it's all really hard. I don't really know what I'm trying to say. What was the question?
I think one of the things that I like, a couple of words I heard in your struggle there. One was creating new ways, and the other one was the word rule was in there too. So there's this pull against what the old rule has been. And I think one of the hardest things for me to learn, and I'm still trying to learn it, is that worship is providing opportunity. There's no way that you can control what happens in worship. And there's also no way that you can control what people hear, what they feel, what they experience. And so all we can do is open up a space and hopefully make it as expansive as possible. So, for example, because the word atheist is so difficult and so problematic and has so much baggage, I try to go with something like I'm a non-theist, right? So I'm playing games with the language because they both mean exactly the same thing. But non-theist doesn't have as much baggage as atheist, right? But I think that one of the things that as someone who's working in the creation of worship, I have to provide a space that is opening and welcoming to the theists among us. Right? That's the challenge, right? Because they're never gonna, like, I didn't start as a non-theist. I started as a dyed-in-the-wool theist. And I knew God the Father really, really well. And my job was to learn more about God the Father so that I could teach others about God the Father. Like, I was in that stream. Now, if I remember the first time I heard John Shelby Spong talk about theism, I was like, oh, they got to get rid of him. Like, this guy's just way out there. And it wasn't until you have some opening, people opening you up to more, and you go, whoa, wait a minute. Yeah. Like this when you hear in the Psalms, people shaking their fist at the divine and saying, basically, where the hell are you when I need you? And how do I experience divinity in that emptiness? How do we do that? Like, how do we open space, and then as the creators of worship, let it go. Do what it does. Jackie, I see you waving.
Well, I'm not a worship creator, but I am an adult educator, I guess I'll use that term. And when I listened to last week's conversation, what came up for me, and it just came up again when you talked about the fertile ground for justice. I know as an adult educator that the most effective way to do transformative, or to open the space for transformative education, is preparing, serving, and then coming back around to reflect on the serving and the people one served and the situation. That is a transformative kind of education. And so when you talked about creating a fertile ground for justice, that got me thinking about that. And the second thing is that way back when I was at seminary, my my master's paper was on how do we how do we enable, how do we create a space for this kind of transformation that you're talking about, transforming our conception of God or our understanding of our role. And what I found is that it's a paradigm shift. And to allow a paradigm shift to happen, you need a safe space, you need a model of a different way to understand. So anyway, I don't want to tell you about my whole thesis, but when you were talking about addressing theists and non-theists at the same time, you can't challenge or talk someone into making that move. You have to just provide a safe space for and perhaps a model or some way of thinking about the other, so that when they're ready for that transformation or something triggers that transformation, they know where to go.
Thanks, Jackie. I want to react to two things that you said there. The first one is you said you're not a worship creator. That's a problem we need to tackle right up front. I think anyone who participates in worship is creating worship.
Okay.
If only by their presence. You need presence in order to create certain types of worship. And so I think that inviting people into that creative process is important. So the other thing that I want to talk about is this notion of safe space. I think that it is important to create safe space. I agree with you wholeheartedly. But sometimes transformative worship is terrifying and it's not safe. And for example, I remember going to one of Matthew Fox's creation masses, a cosmic
Mass. Yeah.
Yeah, it was awful. I hated it. I hated every moment of it. Partly because I walked into that space and what was being created was something that required me to inhabit my body.
Mm-hmm.
And I did not feel safe. I did not know these people. I did not want to dance with these people. I did not like what they were doing with their bodies. And it was not safe. But it was a completely transformative experience. And so I was pushed and challenged and made to feel so uncomfortable. And it was an unpleasant experience. But I walked away from there transformed and a different person. And so for me, it was a total awakening to the notion that we sometimes have to enter into really unsafe spaces in worship. I remember a time in seminary when we created an unsafe space in worship. And you may have even been there, Jackie. It was around the December 6th event in Canada, which was when women were massacred simply because they were women. And we were having a vigil of sorts. And we created a totally unsafe space. And there were men and women involved in the creation of this liturgy. And the male participants in this liturgy were so angry because they didn't feel safe or protected that, it shut down the seminary for a couple of days while we argued this out. And part of the problem was that when we talk about safe spaces, we're often talking about control. We want to control, and we want to be in control. Any Lutherans out there, we want to maintain good order. But, this good order thing is important. Well, if you're talking about creativa, negativa, transformativa, all of these things bubbling and oozing around, who's in control? It's not a safe space. Like, that's the other thing, dualistic thinking. We should create really dangerous spaces. Oh, we should create really safe spaces. No, we have to be open to the reality that sometimes it'll be safe and sometimes it'll be dangerous. Jackie.
I guess what I mean by safe is that no one is going to be crushed by it, but I also know as an adult educator that the times when I let go of control, when you mentioned you create the space, but you can't control what happens. As a teacher or a leader, it's when I create the experience, and then it's when I let go, or I'm not sure what's going to happen or how the outcome is going to come, that the most amazing things happen.
The other thing about no one is going to be crushed by it, sometimes people are going to be crushed by it.
Yeah.
One of the things that I used to tell my council members and sometimes members of the care team, I would say Sunday morning after the service is the most important place for me as a pastor. Because if I've done my job, I've undone somebody, right? I mean, sometimes you'll hesitate when you're preaching and go, no, I'm not going to go there because so-and-so just lost so-and-so, and that will just totally crush them. Or so-and-so is dealing with this, and if I preach on that, that'll undo them. But sometimes you have no idea what you're doing, but you know that you know that your sermon might just unhinge somebody. So my role as the preacher then is to switch into pastoral mode and to have people in the congregation who are also watching the coffee hour who got undone by this worship, and what's the follow-up. And that's part of the deal, right? Like sometimes people who are grieving will say, I can't come to church because if I come to church, I'll just sit there and cry. And I will invite them to come and sit and cry when they're able to. And as someone who's in leadership, you get to see who's crying in the congregation. So I think this via positiva piece, where we want everything to be good and safe and joyful and awe-inspiring and uplifting, has really lent into this, okay, when am I going to get to go and rend my garments and tear things apart and scream and yell? Where do I get that space? Where's the via negativa? Sometimes if we're really if we get the letting go piece, the rending of garments will happen when we least expect it. And that's when you need the presence. That's why I'm saying the worship creators are everyone who's there. That's when you need the presence of the community to hold people up, or to just sit with people, or to listen to people, and that is the worship, right? That's the crucial part of the worship. Is this the what happens after you've finished your program, right? What happens after that? If someone's been transformed and suddenly, you say something, as a worship leader, sometimes you'll say something about some justice issue or some climate problem, and someone will be so inspired by what you said and come up and say, okay, now we have to stop doing this in church. And you're like, wait a minute, I didn't think about that. Do we really have to stop doing this? So you have to be prepared for someone to be transformed in the worship and move to a place that you weren't prepared to go to. Renee.
Yes, thank you for
Oh.
bringing up the Cosmic Mass. I went through that in the Parliament of Religions. I think it was 2018 or something in Toronto. And I had already been to some seminars with Matthew Fox out here in California, and we just fell in love with his whole presentation. But this ceremony that I attended, the Cosmic Mass, was the most amazing thing I had ever gone through, because I literally felt brought through those 4 stages that you presented. Negativa, positiva, creativa. But when we got to the part of wailing, and crying. And what happened, it was like, I can't even explain it, but it was very profound transformation is what it was, because much of this stuff is wordless. You cannot place a word on it. But as you just said, afterwards, all that room full of strangers, all of a sudden, were there for you. Everybody was for everybody in that moment in time, and it was amazing. How people supported each other and were amazed by the whole process. So it was like a journey, and he artfully drew us through and all of those things to open ourselves up, not only to ourselves, but to all the people around us.
Thank you. I also think that, and Steve, I saw your hand a while ago. I'll come up to you next. I also think that one of the things that seeps into what we're talking about here is our consumer culture. So rather than lend our presence to something that we might not be comfortable with, we're like, well, what am I going to get out of this except being uncomfortable? Now, you can't be uncomfortable at every experience, but there are times when your presence is required as maybe a stabilizing influence, right? Or maybe someone who's going to be able to sit with those folks like me who hate the wailing part, right? I don't want to do the wailing. No, let's not do that. I'm being facetious here, but I think that there are places in the worship, like I remember once being invited to a monastery, and they were doing something called a tripudium, which is an elaborate processional dance, which you had to learn 3 steps for. Only 3, but that was beyond my capability. And so I remember feeling so uncomfortable and not liking it at all, and couldn't get past that in my head until someone made me laugh at myself, right? So that person wasn't particularly comfortable with what we were doing either, but they knew how to set me at ease. And that's what I mean about all of us being worship creators. And we're going someplace into this, we're creating something, and the transformations are all beyond our control. Steve, you had your hand up.
Yes. I mean, I think one of the main problems we have with the via negativa is what we're going through right now with COVID and our reaction to this. And we want to just to go away as opposed to using it as a mechanism to evaluate, to dream, if you want to, from your last sermon, to look at, okay, things aren't quite right. What's the opportunity to change this, and as opposed to, well, we just have to grit our teeth or maybe hope that technology solves the problem, whatever, where that's really not the issue. So we tend to avoid suffering and not learn from it, and that's part of our consumer culture too. And so I think the church should be willing to roll back and say, this is how things can evolve. I mean, basically, evolution usually only happens when there's chaos, and nature has to react to it, and consequently something better usually comes out of it. With us, we want to fight it. And so I think that's an important point.
I think that I like what you're saying, as long as we always put the caveat, because Christianity has this emphasis on suffering that is dangerous, particularly where women are concerned. So I'm very cautious when I talk about discovering divinity within suffering. Because we have a really grim history within our own tradition around the suffering piece, and this veneration of Jesus as suffering and dying for us is somewhat problematic. I saw a couple of hands waved there. Andrew, did you catch who was waving?
Jackie,
Okay.
is that a wave?
And yet, on the other hand, traditional Christianity has not validated the negative experience. I know my father died when I was 16. And of course, the church said, you shouldn't be sad. He's gone to a better place. There's heaven, which takes away all that suffering piece, or it invalidates it, let's call it that. Or the whole thing about, it must be God's will. Or when my life at St. Peter's Kitchener blew up, someone said to me, oh, God never shuts one door without another one opening. So we've taken away or invalidated the experience of the via negativa, I guess I'll call it.
Lament.
Yeah. And so just a word of caution here, via positiva can also include lament. So it's not positive and negative experience. It's the falling away of words is the
Yes, but you were talking about
the suffering in Christianity. Yeah. And I get that.
Suffering, and it's two-sided.
It is. And so I just want us to be cautious around the notion of suffering. The other thing is that we have this parable of Jesus, which is really a wisdom parable, if you like.
Jackie, I totally agree with you. And I think, there's good to become of acknowledging suffering. And like Pastor Don said, we don't want to take it too far, but suffering shouldn't just be accepted. Suffering should enable us to look and try to change things possibly better. So, like suffering, like women, just old Christianity, submit to your husband and whatever, just suffer through it because suffering is good. It's not the point. It's suffering is something that we need to look at and evaluate to evolve to something else.
One of the things in terms of the via negativa is what one can experience in the falling away of words. What one, let's take that word love, for example, and the word suffering. Language functions by symbolizing something. And so we have a notion of what suffering is, and we have a notion of what love is. And so when we're opened to a new experience in terms of love, it can shatter our understanding of what that word love means. And sometimes it can rob that word of all former meanings, and take us to a place where we can no longer speak because we have no more images to put to the language. Same thing with suffering. That's called, in technical terms, in terms of worship and in terms of religion, it's called Apotheism. It means the falling away of words, the falling away of images, and moving into experience. Within Buddhism, it has a whole other connotation. Within the Christian mystics, it also is a primary piece. It's this notion that eventually, as we fall into divinity or an awareness or a connection to divinity, all words and images fall away. And what you're left with is whatever this essence of experience is. Now, we're humans, so we need images and we need words to work to symbolize things. I mean, the analogy is that we sometimes, if you had a cupboard full of tins without labels on them, it might be fun for a while to open up a tin and not know what you're getting, but eventually you want to know what's in the damn tin. And so labels are important, language is important. But what happens is we tend to idealize the meanings we have ascribed, the symbols we have ascribed to both the word and the experience that the word's trying to capture. And so what worship at its best does is cause those words, cause the symbol, what those words are symbolizing, to fall away. Because a symbol is designed to point beyond itself, to the meaning that's behind it. So, for example, the best way I know to describe this is the difference between an icon and an idol. So an idol is something that someone would worship, the actual idol itself. Now, this can happen with people who say, I worship nature, right? So you have just turned nature, let's take a tree, for example. You've just turned that tree into an idol. It's an icon when you recognize that beyond that tree, so that the tree becomes a way into what is beyond the tree. The same as the cross. People who worship the cross or worship the idea and the notion of Jesus, as opposed to what Jesus is pointing to. Read the stories of Jesus. It's always, I'm pointing beyond myself, right? Don't worship me. It's I and the Father are one, you know? It's like, you like me? Well, that's because I'm part of this big oneness, right? And so that's why we need the falling away of words. It's why we need this apophatic piece, which most of our worship is what's called cataphatic, which we function with symbols and with words. And they can only take you so far. Otherwise, you're worshiping the symbols and worshiping the words. Remember the language wars we went through, 20 years ago, where we were worshiping the Father. That turned the Father into an idol as opposed to an icon. The word Father for God is wonderful, provided it's pointing to something way more beyond it. It's when we begin to idolize our symbols that we run into problems. And even nature, when we begin to idolize nature, we leave a whole element out of nature, right? Because can't think about that, because that's really horrific. It's one of the reasons why I like David Attenborough, because when you watch David Attenborough's wonderful documentaries, it's a little different than the Mutual of Omaha, which I watched when I was a kid, where all the stories about the animals were so lovely. They were so nice. And you didn't really get to see animals devouring other animals. That's part of this cosmos which we are in. Life is born out of stars that die. Our parents die. And how do we have the full experience of that? Death has become negative in the small sense of that word, not negativa. It's become negative. And so what can we learn in death? What can we experience in death? How can we move into death? Those kinds of questions don't fit well into the kind of worship that we've developed over the last few hundred years. Steve?
And the challenge for you and for all churches and whatever is getting that via negativa portion into the worship service. Basically the apophatic version, because people are uncomfortable with that, with silence, with meditation and whatever. It's a real challenge, and I guess you have to do it in small doses and build up their tolerance to it. But that's a tough one.
Okay, you just gave me a wonderful segue to conclude the conversation with, and that is that one of the things we did with worship is we put it in this tiny little box. 1 hour on Sunday. And maybe you can have devotions when you wake up in the morning, and maybe you can say grace at dinner, and maybe you can say thank you at the end of the day. Like, that's what we did with worship. And so it's a very slim diet. And you can't possibly get all of this bubbling ooze into that. Worship is being in the world, right? It's walking through life with an awareness of the more. I mean, when I look at what's outside my front window here, the sky, like the very first sort of worship impulse is awe and wonder at the sky. But it can also be looking at this screen. Mary Ellen, you talked about connection. If you'd have told me that a computer would become a place of awe and wonder at these beautiful humans that I get to see, I mean, that's amazing. The connections that get to be forged over, I don't know how you all got onto my computer screen in my office. I have no idea how any of this works, but I'm just awestruck by the faces that I see. And the more that we experience one another, the bigger that awe becomes. And so one of the things that I wanted to break us out of was this notion that we're going to do 10 minutes of worship at the beginning of our chat and 5 minutes of worship at the end of our chat. The chat was worship. All of it is worship. It's coming together with an openness to the reality that there's so much more involved in everything that we are a part of. And isn't that amazing? Now, we can't all worship all the time. It's really hard to worship all the time. But there's so many opportunities in the course of a day to open ourselves to that more. And I think that's why the via negativa is so crucial, because what can we learn in the darkness? What can we learn in the suffering? There's a line in a hymn that we used to sing about being grateful for the reality of death, because it brings so much more life to life. And for me, the Jesus piece was all about freeing us from so much concern about what happens next when this life is over, and living this life more fully and becoming more fully human all the time. And for me, worship is a place where I can become more human. So that takes us a little over time. I want to thank you for traveling through Advent together. It's been a joy to be with you through Advent. These are strange times. And so you've grounded me. I didn't even get a chance to get into Matthew Fox, who talks a lot about being grounded and setting boundaries and in worship, and those things are important too. And we'll talk about those in another day. But I think this notion of being grounded is a really important thing in these strange times. So I want to thank you for keeping me on the ground through a lot of this. I hope you're all okay. Everybody okay? And you've all got good plans for the next week or so to stay grounded. As I said, I'll be sending out an email to let you know when we'll resume the chats on Tuesday morning. For now, I invite you to open yourselves to that which is beyond yourself. And as we celebrate this notion of new birth that is coming forth, I invite you to experience in yourself the one who is beyond all of us, the one who is love beyond our ability to understand love. And so peace be with you, dear friends, as you navigate these unusual times, and see you in the new year. Peace.
Thanks. Many blessings.